Do you think you truly know your family? Maybe you believe your poverty is just bad luck. Look at the turkey on this Thanksgiving table. It is the only honest thing here. Tonight, I found out my parents and sister built their fortune on the ruins of my life. Behind my desperate eyes, a deadlier trap is waiting. Don't walk away, because the truth my grandmother is about to scream will redefine family for you forever. My name is Genevieve Alcott. And as I pulled my battered sedan into the winding gravel driveway of my parents' estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, I felt like a ghost haunting a life I was no longer allowed to live. The biting November wind whipped across the manicured lawn, tugging at the frayed hem of my coat, a coat I had bought secondhand 3 winters ago, because every spare cent I earned went into the bottomless pit of my student loans. I checked my reflection in the cracked rearview mirror, adjusting my hair to cover the exhaustion etched into the lines around my eyes. I had spent the last 14 hours on my feet, transitioning from a grueling shift as a junior drafter at a firm that paid me in peanuts to a 4-hour stint as a night shift barista. I was 26 years old, an architecture graduate with honors, and yet I was currently 5 days away from being completely homeless. My landlord had changed the locks 2 nights ago because I was 3 months behind on rent, and my meager belongings were currently stuffed into 2 duffel bags in the trunk of this car. The Alcott mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling colonial revival draped in tasteful white lights that shimmered against the early evening frost. It was a monument to old money and carefully curated success, a place where the scent of rosemary-rubbed turkey and expensive mahogany wax hung heavy in the air. As I stepped through the heavy oak front doors, the warmth of the foyer hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it the sounds of clinking crystal and the sharp, melodic laughter of my younger sister. Serafina, my mother, Eleanor, appeared at the top of the marble staircase, her silk dress rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She didn't offer a hug or a smile. Instead, her eyes raked over my faded jeans and the slight scuff on my boots, with a look of profound disappointment. She checked her gold watch, noting it was exactly 6 o'clock. She told me that I was barely on time and that I looked like I had crawled out of a gutter. I tried to tell her that traffic on the interstate was a nightmare, but she had already turned away, adjusting a vase of white lilies that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. In the dining room, the table was a masterpiece of excess. Fine china, silver cutlery that had been in the family for 3 generations, and bottles of vintage Bordeaux that cost $400 apiece. My father, Richard, was already seated at the head of the table, nursing a glass of scotch. He gave me a brief, curt nod that felt more like a dismissal than a greeting. Beside him sat my sister, Serafina, who looked like she had stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. Her husband, Julian, sat next to her, looking smug in a tailored navy suit, the guest of honor. However, was my grandmother, Margaret Alcott. She had just returned from a 5-year residency in London, and her presence dominated the room. She sat perfectly upright, her silver hair styled in a sharp bob, her eyes as cold and gray as the North Atlantic. She didn't speak much as the first course, a delicate butternut squash soup, was served. She simply watched us, her gaze flickering from one person to the next, like a predator assessing its prey. Serafina couldn't wait 3 minutes before she began her usual routine of self-glorification. She lifted her hand, intentionally catching the light on the massive pear-shaped diamond ring on her finger. She announced to the table that Julian had surprised her with it for their 2-year anniversary, claiming it was at least 5 carats of flawless perfection. Julian leaned in, kissing her cheek, and added that it was the least he could do for his queen. My mother cooed over the ring, praising Serafina for her impeccable taste and her blessed life. Then, as if on cue, the conversation turned to me. My father leaned back, swirling his wine, and asked if I was still drawing floor plans for public restrooms. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and said it was a shame that such an expensive education was being wasted on someone who couldn't even afford a decent haircut. Eleanor joined in, sighing heavily as she told Margaret that they had tried to help me. They really had, but that I was simply too stubborn and lacked the Alcott drive. She said I was content to live in squalor and that it was an embarrassment to the family name. I felt the familiar sting of tears pricking at my eyelids, but I forced them back. They didn't know that I was working 80 hours a week. They didn't know that my bank account currently held exactly $18.42. They didn't know that I had skipped lunch today, so I would have enough gas money to drive here. I sat there, picking at my food, feeling the weight of their scorn like a lead weight in my chest. Serafina then pulled out her latest iPhone, the gold-finished model, and began scrolling through her social media feed. She turned the screen toward our grandmother, showing off a series of high-resolution photos. She gushed about her new acquisition, a stunning penthouse in Manhattan with a floor-to-ceiling view of Central Park. She talked about the Italian marble in the kitchen and the private elevator access. Claiming she and Julian had just closed the deal last month, my parents beamed with pride, calling her a visionary and a true success story. I looked at the photos on the screen. The layout was breathtaking, a perfect example of modern brutalism softened by organic textures. It was the kind of space I had dreamed of designing when I was in architecture school. Seeing my sister possess it while I was wondering where I would sleep tonight felt like a jagged piece of glass turning in my heart. I was drowning in debt, working 3 soul-crushing jobs just to stay afloat, while she lived in a $5 million cloudscape. Throughout all of this, Grandmother Margaret remained silent. She hadn't touched her wine, and her soup sat nearly finished. Her silence was beginning to feel heavy, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Serafina noticed it too and tried to fill the gap by asking Margaret about her flight from Heathrow. But Margaret didn't answer. Suddenly, the sharp, hollow ring of crystal hitting wood echoed through the dining room. Margaret had slammed her wineglass down onto the mahogany table with such force that a few drops of red wine splashed onto the white linen cloth. The laughter died instantly. Richard froze with his glass halfway to his lips. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Margaret didn't look at my parents. She didn't look at Serafina or Julian. Her icy gray eyes were fixed directly on me, piercing through my facade of quiet desperation. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low, raspy, and carried a terrifying edge of suppressed fury. She looked at me and asked what I had done with the property. I blinked, confused, my voice trembling as I asked her what she meant. Margaret leaned forward, her shadow stretching long across the table in the candlelight. She repeated herself, her voice growing louder and more commanding. She demanded to know why Serafina was bragging about a Manhattan penthouse that Margaret had purchased in my name exactly 4 years ago. She said she had spent $5 million to ensure my future as an architect, and she wanted to know why I was sitting there looking like a beggar while my sister claimed my home as her own. I froze. The fork in my hand slipped, clattering against my plate. I looked at the $5 million figure in my head, a number so vast it felt like a fantasy. I looked at my grandmother, then at the pale, panicked faces of my parents, and then back to Margaret. My heart began to drum a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I felt the world tilt on its axis, the luxury of the room blurring into a smear of gold and white. My mouth went dry, and I could barely find the breath to speak. I looked her in the eye and told her that I had no idea about any penthouse, and that I had never seen a single cent of $5 million in my entire life. The ringing in my ears was so loud that for a moment, the opulent dining room faded into a blur of flickering candlelight and distorted shadows. I stared at Grandmother Margaret, my mouth hanging slightly open, my brain struggling to process the string of words she had just unleashed. $5 million, a penthouse in Manhattan. 4 years ago, the concepts were as foreign to me as a distant galaxy. My fingers lost their grip, and the heavy silver fork clattered against the edge of my fine china plate before sliding onto the mahogany table. The sound was like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the room. I tried to speak, but my throat felt as though it were filled with dry sand. I finally managed to push the words out, my voice a thin, shaky rasp that sounded like it belonged to a stranger. I looked her in the eye and said, "I have no idea about it." The reaction was instantaneous. Margaret's face, already stern, hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't see a victim. She saw a liar. She slammed her hand onto the table again, making the wine glasses dance. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing to slits as she spat out her words. She told me not to dare play the fool with her. She said she had worked 70 years to build the Alcott legacy, and she knew exactly where every cent of her money went. She accused me of being a spoiled, ungrateful child who had probably gambled the property away or lost it in some drug-fueled haze of Manhattan nightlife. She told the table that she had expected better from the girl she thought was the brightest of the bunch, but it seemed I had spent the last 4 years proving her wrong by hiding my failures behind a curtain of silence. The injustice of it scorched through my veins. I felt a sob rise in my chest, hot and jagged. I didn't care about the etiquette of the Alcott dinner table anymore. I stood up, my chair screeching against the hardwood floor, and the tears I had been fighting finally spilled over. I told her through my sobs that she was wrong. I told her that for the last 4 years, I had been living a nightmare that had nothing to do with expensive parties or penthouse views. I explained that I was currently homeless, that I had been sleeping in my car for the last 48 hours because I couldn't even scrounge together $200 for a cheap motel. I told her about my 3 jobs, the 14-hour days at the drafting firm where I was treated like a servant, the night shifts at the coffee shop where I burned my hands for minimum wage, and the weekend janitorial work that left my fingernails stained with bleach. I shouted that I didn't have a single asset to my name, not even a savings account with more than $20 in it. My father, Richard, suddenly surged to his feet, his face a sickly shade of gray under the warm glow of the chandelier. He stepped toward Margaret, his hands raised in a placating gesture that felt oily and false. He told Margaret to calm down and that she wasn't thinking clearly. He suggested that her memory was failing her after such a long flight from London, and that perhaps the jet lag was causing her to mix up her accounts. He spoke with a patronizing softness, telling her that we should all just sit down and finish the meal, and that he would help her look through her papers tomorrow morning when she was rested. He was trying to bury the truth under a mountain of fake concern, his eyes darting toward me with a silent, lethal warning to shut my mouth. Eleanor joined in. Her voice pitched an octave too high as she began to fuss with the serving platters. She began talking about the gravy, saying it was getting a skin on it and that we shouldn't let the beautiful organic turkey go to waste over a simple misunderstanding. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with a silk napkin, her movements frantic and disjointed. She told Margaret that Genevieve was clearly just having one of her episodes, and that we shouldn't take anything I said seriously because I was overworked and prone to exaggeration. The air in the room grew heavy, a physical weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. I could feel the gaslighting like a physical shroud, a thick fog of lies intended to choke out the reality of my suffering. But Margaret Alcott was not a woman who could be easily diverted. She ignored my parents entirely. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached for her Hermes handbag that sat on the floor beside her chair. The sound of the zipper opening was like the cocking of a hammer. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope bound with a heavy rubber band. She didn't say a word as she snapped the band and pulled out a stack of documents. These weren't just notes. They were official deeds, titles, and property transfer agreements. She fanned them out across the table like a deck of cards, her fingers trembling slightly with a mix of age and rage. At the top of the stack was a document with the official seal of the New York County Clerk. I leaned forward, my vision blurred by tears. And I saw it. There, in bold black ink, was my name, Genevieve Alcott. Property: the Sentinel Penthouse, Central Park West. Date of purchase: October 14th, 4 years ago. I turned my gaze to Serafina, my younger sister, who usually dominated any room with her loud, brassy confidence, was now shrinking into her velvet-upholstered chair. Her face was no longer the picture of aristocratic beauty. It was a pale, sweating mask of terror. Her hands, still adorned with that massive 5-carat diamond, were shaking so violently that she had to tuck them beneath the white linen of the tablecloth to hide them. Her husband, Julian, was staring at the documents with a frozen expression, his jaw tight enough to snap. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine and any movement would be his last. I looked back at the photos Serafina had been showing off just minutes ago on her phone. I recognized the unique architectural details. Now the cantilevered balcony, the specific grain of the Italian Calicotta marble, the custom-built floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It was the exact same property listed in the documents on the table. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the stomach, knocking the air from my lungs. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a mix-up of memories. My sister wasn't just wealthy. She was living in my home. She was waking up to the view that was meant for me, cooking in the kitchen that was my gift, and walking on the floors that my grandmother had paid for with the intention of securing my future. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me, replacing the frantic panic of moments ago. I looked at the property transfer agreement again, and I noticed something else. Below my name, there was a section for a designated guardian or manager, since I had been only 22 at the time of the purchase. That section was filled out in my father's handwriting. It stated that because of my documented mental instability and incapacity for financial management, Richard Alcott would act as the sole trustee and executor of the property until such time as he deemed me fit. The pieces of the last 4 years began to click into place with a terrifying, mechanical precision. My sudden failure to land jobs after perfect interviews, the way my credit cards were always declined despite me never using them, the letters that never arrived, the constant narrative that I was sick and unstable, that my parents had fed to everyone we knew. They hadn't just stolen a house, they had stolen my identity. They had systematically dismantled my life, brick by brick, to ensure that I would never be strong enough or independent enough to discover the wealth that was waiting for me. They had kept me in a state of perpetual, manufactured poverty, so that Serafina could play the part of the Manhattan socialite using my resources. I looked at my mother, who was now staring at her plate as if she could disappear into the pattern of the china. I looked at my father, whose eyes were fixed on the wine bottle, his face a mask of cold, calculating arrogance. There was no remorse in this room. There was only the bitter, metallic taste of a betrayal so deep it felt like a violation of my very soul. The Thanksgiving turkey sat in the center of the table, its skin glistening and golden, a centerpiece for a family that didn't exist. We were not a family. We were a collection of predators and one battered, exhausted prey who had finally stopped running. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence before a storm, the heavy static-charged air that precedes a lightning strike. Grandmother Margaret picked up one of the documents, the one Serafina had supposedly signed as the new owner recently, and compared it to the original deed. Her eyes flickered to her daughter-in-law and her son, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than coldness in her expression. I saw a profound, bone-deep disgust. The truth was no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It was a screaming, undeniable presence at the table. And the illegal occupation of my life was about to be met with a reckoning that none of them were prepared for. I felt the weight of my grandmother's gaze shift from the papers back to my father, and I knew that the freezing truth had finally set us all on a path toward a total, irreversible destruction of the Alcott name. I sat back down, not because I was defeated, but because the floor no longer felt steady beneath my feet. I watched as my sister's breath came in short, jagged gasps, her eyes darting toward the exit. But there was nowhere for her to go. The house of cards they had built on top of me was starting to collapse, and I was going to make sure that I was the one who watched every single piece of it burn to the ground. "Julian," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "I believe you mentioned that you and Serafina purchased that property last month. I would very much like to see the bank records for that transaction, because as far as these documents are concerned, no money has ever changed hands, except for the $5 million I wired from London 4 years ago. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. The illegal reality of their situation had finally locked around them like a cage, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was trapped. Richard cleared his throat, a sound that usually signaled the start of a board meeting, but tonight it was the opening note of a symphony of lies. He smoothed his silk tie with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, and he looked at Grandmother Margaret with an expression of profound, weary sadness. He said that he had hoped they would never have to discuss my condition in front of guests, even family like Julian. He leaned toward Margaret, his voice dropping into a tone of staged confidentiality, telling her that the truth was much more painful than a simple financial dispute. He claimed that ever since I graduated, I had been suffering from severe psychological lapses and a dissociative identity disorder that made me completely unreliable when it came to reality. He told the table that I often forgot entire months of my life, including the day I sat in his office and begged him to take the burden of the penthouse off my hands, because the responsibility was making me hear voices. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might bruise the bone. I tried to interrupt, to scream that he was lying, but Eleanor was faster. She reached across the table, her fingers digging into the flesh of my forearm with a grip that was meant to silence me. She looked at Margaret with tears welling in her eyes, tears that I knew were as fake as the designer pearls around her neck. She whispered that they had been trying to protect me from myself. She told my grandmother that they had managed the property in secret because I was a magnet for scammers and lowlifes who would have stripped me bare within a week if I had been left in charge of a $5 million asset. She said they hadn't told me about the money or the house for my own safety, fearing that the knowledge would trigger another one of my manic breaks. Then came the pressure. It was like being caught in a vice that was slowly tightening around my skull. Richard looked at me, his eyes cold and commanding, and told me to be a good girl and admit the truth. He said I was clearly having an episode right now, that the stress of the holiday had pushed me over the edge. He urged me to tell Margaret that I wasn't feeling well, that I had forgotten the arrangements we made, and that I needed to go lie down. He promised that if I just admitted I was unwell and ended this scene, they would take care of me. They would get me the help I supposedly needed. It was a blatant attempt to discredit me before I could say another word. A desperate move to make me the villain in my own tragedy. As they spoke, a wave of memories crashed over me, each one a jagged reminder of the cruelty I had endured while they sat on a fortune that belonged to me. I remembered a Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago when my car had broken down on the side of the interstate. I had called Richard, sobbing, begging for a loan of just $500 to fix the transmission so I wouldn't lose my job. He had laughed at me, a cold, mocking sound over the phone, and told me that I was a bottomless pit of need and that my laziness was the reason I was struggling. He told me that a real Alcott wouldn't beg for scraps. I remembered Eleanor telling me at Easter that I looked haggard and cheap, and that I should be grateful she even let me sit at her table considering I brought nothing but shame to the family. They had called me a worthless failure for years, all while they were siphoning off my inheritance to fund their own delusions of grandeur. Serafina, seeing that the narrative was shifting back in their favor, shed her mask of terror and replaced it with a sneer of pure arrogance. She didn't even look at me. She looked at Margaret. She said that a girl who spent her days in a stained apron smelling of burnt espresso beans and her nights scrubbing floors didn't belong on Central Park West. She claimed that the penthouse was a work of art and that it would be a crime against architecture to let someone as common and broken as Genevieve live there. She told the table that she had been doing the family a favor by occupying the space and maintaining its social standing. She said that the penthouse was where she belonged, among the elite, not wasted on a sister who couldn't even keep a roof over her own head without their charity, Julian, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice smooth and devoid of any remorse. He leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks, and admitted that his parents were currently living in the guest suite of the penthouse. He said it was a wedding gift from Serafina, a way to ensure that their family legacy was respected. He looked at me as if I were a smudge of dirt on a pristine floor and said that they had all agreed it was the best use of the space. He claimed that my condition made it impossible for me to appreciate such luxury anyway. So what did it matter who was actually living there as long as the Alcott name was on the door? The room felt like it was shrinking. The walls closing in on me. I looked at their faces. Richard's smug certainty, Eleanor's performative grief, Serafina's vitriolic entitlement, and Julian's cold indifference. I realized then that this wasn't just a financial theft. This was a coordinated, multi-year conspiracy to erase my existence. They hadn't just taken the money. They had tried to steal my mind. They wanted me to believe I was crazy, so that I would never question why my life was so hard. They had built a wall of deceit so high and so thick that they thought I would never be able to see over it. They were counting on my shame, my exhaustion, and my love for them to keep me quiet. They were waiting for me to break, to crumble under the weight of their gaslighting and crawl away into the night like the unstable girl they claimed I was. Throughout this entire exchange, Grandmother Margaret hadn't moved a muscle. She sat like a marble statue at the end of the table, her hands folded over the silver head of her cane. Her silence was terrifying, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. She didn't look at the documents anymore. She looked into the souls of her children and her granddaughter. Her eyes were like two gray stones, unyielding and impossible to read. The more they lied, the deeper the silence around her became. It was the silence of a judge who had already reached a verdict and was simply waiting for the executioner to arrive. Something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a slow break. It was a violent, seismic shift. The years of hunger, the double shifts, the cold nights in my car, the humiliation of being called a failure, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. I realized that if I didn't fight now, I would be buried alive in their lies. I wouldn't just lose the house, I would lose my very self. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. With a sudden, explosive motion, I reached out and swept my arm across the table, the fine china plates, the crystal wine glasses, and the silver gravy boat went flying. The sound of shattering porcelain and glass filled the room, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of destruction that cut through their lies like a blade. Red wine splattered across Eleanor's silk dress, looking like a fresh wound. Richard jumped back, his chair toppling over as he tried to avoid the debris. I stood there, my breathing heavy, my eyes fixed on my father. I told him to look at me. I shouted that I was not sick, I was not crazy, and I was certainly not forgetting a single thing. I told him that I remembered every insult, every rejected loan, and every night I spent wondering why my own parents hated me so much. I told Eleanor that her protection was nothing more than a slow-motion murder of my future. I looked at Serafina and told her that every second she spent in that penthouse was a second she was stealing from my soul. I turned to my grandmother and, with a clarity that cut through the remaining tension in the room, I told her that I was perfectly, dangerously sane. I said that the only people in this room who were unwell were the ones who thought they could destroy their own flesh and blood for the sake of a Manhattan zip code. I told them that the masquerade was over and that I was going to take back every single thing they had stolen, starting with the truth. The dining room, once a sanctuary of elite manners, was now a wreckage of broken glass and spilled wine. My parents stared at me in genuine shock, their madness narrative shattered along with the plates. They had expected me to whimper and fade away. But for the first time in 26 years, an Alcott was standing up to them, and I wasn't going to stop until there was nothing left of their world but the dust I left behind. "Genevieve," Richard whispered, his voice finally cracking with real fear. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. Dad," I replied, my voice as cold as the November wind outside. "I'm finally waking up." Margaret Alcott slowly uncrossed her hands. She looked at the mess on the table, then at me, and a tiny, almost imperceptible nod escaped her. The judge was ready to speak. The debris of shattered porcelain and spilled wine lay between us like a battlefield. But Grandmother Margaret didn't even glance at the mess. She leaned her chin on the silver handle of her cane, her eyes boring into mine with a look of profound confusion that quickly sharpened into something far more dangerous. She asked me, her voice trembling with a rare note of vulnerability, why I had never once acknowledged the letters she had written to me every single week for the last 48 months. She wanted to know where the money was. She told the table that she had sent a certified cashier's check for $2,500 on the first day of every month, intended to cover my living expenses so I could focus entirely on my architectural internships. By her calculation, she had sent over $120,000 in direct aid, none of which had ever been mentioned in our brief, stilted holiday phone calls. I felt as though the floor had vanished beneath my feet. I stared at her, my breath hitching in my throat, and told her that I had never received a single letter. I had never seen a check. I had never even known she was trying to reach me outside of the 2-minute scripted calls I was allowed on Christmas and her birthday. I told her that for 4 years, I had lived in a vacuum of silence, believing that she had forgotten me the moment she stepped onto that plane for London. I told her that I had spent nights crying myself to sleep, wondering why my own grandmother, the woman who had always been my champion, had suddenly gone cold. Richard let out a sharp, scoffing sound, the sound of a man trying to laugh off a death sentence. He wiped a smudge of wine from his cuff and told Margaret that she was being dramatic. He suggested that the United States Postal Service was notoriously unreliable these days and that letters were lost in the system all the time. He turned to me with a look of feigned pity and told the table that I had probably thrown the mail away during one of my dark periods. He claimed that my mental state was so fractured that I likely saw the envelopes and mistook them for bills or junk mail, tossing them into the incinerator without a second thought. He even had the audacity to suggest that I had cashed the checks and simply spent the money on my supposed delusions before forgetting the entire transaction. Margaret's eyes snapped to his, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She told him to stop lying. She revealed that she was a woman of business and that she didn't leave things to chance. She said she had sent every single one of those letters via certified mail with a return receipt requested. She told him that she had a filing cabinet in London filled with 48 pink slips of paper, each one bearing a signature confirming that the mail had been delivered to this very address in Greenwich. She asked him who had been signing for my life for the last 4 years. I looked at my mother, Eleanor. Her face was the color of chalk, and her hands were twisting her silk napkin into a tight, frantic rope. I saw her eyes dart toward the corner of the room where our longtime housekeeper, Martha, was standing in the shadows. Eleanor made a sharp, subtle jerking motion with her head, a silent command for Martha to leave the room. I followed her gaze and saw Eleanor's hand twitch toward the hallway that led to Richard's private study and the service stairs. It was a classic, destroy the evidence maneuver. As transparent as glass. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't care about the rules of the house anymore. I surged forward, sidestepping the broken glass, and intercepted Martha before she could slip through the door. I told her to stay exactly where she was. Eleanor shrieked my name, telling me that I was being hysterical and that I was scaring the staff. She stood up, her voice rising to a frantic pitch, and told me to get back to the table. She said that there was nothing in the study but private tax documents and that I had no right to invade their privacy. But I knew this house. I knew the secrets hidden in its bones. I remembered the old brass mailbox built into the wall of the basement, a relic from the 1950s that my father had never bothered to decommission. It was where the mail was sorted before it was brought upstairs. I turned away from the dining room and ran toward the basement door. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps behind me and the sound of Seraphina's voice screaming at me to stop. I reached the basement door and flung it open, the cool, damp air of the lower level rushing up to meet me. I practically flew down the stairs, my heart thundering in my ears. The basement was a labyrinth of storage crates and old furniture, but I made a straight line for the small utility room near the furnace. There, mounted on the wall, was the heavy brass box. It was locked, but the key was always kept on a small hook behind a stack of dusty National Geographic magazines. I grabbed the key, my fingers trembling so much I almost dropped it twice. Just as I jammed the key into the lock, a hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around with staggering force. It was Serafina. Her face was distorted with a mix of rage and panic, her perfect makeup smeared with sweat. She told me to get my filthy hands off their property. She shoved me back against the cold stone wall, shouting that I was a parasite who was trying to ruin the family just because I was jealous of her success. She tried to grab the key from my hand, her long, manicured nails scratching at my skin. We entered a frantic, ugly scuffle in the dim light of the basement. I wasn't the weak, starving girl she thought I was anymore. The 4 years of manual labor, of carrying heavy crates and scrubbing floors, had given me a strength she couldn't imagine. I shoved her back, telling her that she was pathetic. I told her that she was a thief who was wearing my life like a stolen coat. She lunged at me again, screaming that I was nothing, but I caught her wrists and pinned her against a storage rack. I told her to look at herself, a grown woman fighting in a basement to hide a pile of stolen paper. I shoved her away one last time and turned back to the mailbox. I twisted the key and the heavy door creaked open. My heart stopped. The box was overflowing. It wasn't just a few letters. It was a mountain of correspondence. Hundreds of white envelopes with British stamps, all addressed to Genevieve Alcott. I reached in and pulled out a handful. Each one had been opened, the edges torn roughly. Inside the first envelope was a letter from Grandmother Margaret, filled with words of love and encouragement, and a voided check for $2,500. The checks hadn't been cashed because they didn't need the cash. They had already siphoned off my $5 million trust. They had kept the letters here to ensure I never knew someone was looking for me. They had buried my grandmother's voice in a basement to keep me silent. I gathered as many as I could carry, clutching the evidence to my chest like a shield. Serafina was slumped on the floor, sobbing now. Not out of remorse, but because she knew it was over. I walked past her, up the stairs, and back into the dining room. The scene I returned to was one of frozen terror. My father was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. My mother was clutching a glass of water with both hands, her teeth chattering against the rim. Grandmother Margaret was standing now, her tall frame silhouetted against the fireplace. I walked to the table and dumped the pile of stolen letters directly onto the center of the wreckage. The white envelopes fanned out over the red wine stains and the broken china. I picked up one of the letters and read a single line aloud. "Genevieve, my darling, I haven't heard from you in months, but I hope this check helps you finish your portfolio." I looked at my father and asked him how many times he had stood in that basement and looked at these letters while I was calling him to ask for grocery money. Eleanor tried one last time. She reached for the letters, her voice a thin, pathetic whine. She said they were just keeping them safe until I was stable enough to handle the emotions of a long-distance relationship. She said they didn't want to overwhelm me. The sound that followed was the most definitive thing I had ever heard. Grandmother Margaret raised her heavy mahogany cane and brought it down on the table with a crash that sounded like a falling tree. The force of the blow snapped one of the table's decorative edges. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She told everyone to sit down. Her voice was as cold as a grave. She looked at Richard, then Eleanor, and finally at Serafina, who had crawled back into the room and was cowering by the door. Margaret adjusted her silk scarf and smoothed her hair, her movements precise and terrifyingly calm. She looked at the family she had funded and supported for decades and told them that she had spent her life building a legacy of honor, only to find she had raised a pack of hyenas. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. She told the room that she had seen enough. She said the lies were exhausted, the excuses were hollow, and her patience had finally reached its absolute limit. She turned to the door, where the sound of a car approaching the driveway could be heard through the heavy curtains. She looked back at the wreckage of the Thanksgiving dinner and declared that the play was over. She said the curtain was falling on the Alcott family as they knew it. She looked at me, her eyes finally softening for a fraction of a second. Before turning back to her son with a look of utter lethality, she announced that the masquerade had reached its final act and that it was time for the world to see what was hiding beneath their masks. "The play ends here," she said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. At that exact moment, the front doorbell rang a long, demanding chime that signaled the arrival of the reckoning we had all been waiting for. The heavy chime of the doorbell hadn't even finished echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the foyer when the front door swung open with a decisive thud. I expected a delivery driver or perhaps a confused neighbor, but the man who stepped into the light of the entryway carried the unmistakable aura of a shark in a tailored suit. He was tall, perhaps in his late 40-somethings, with salt and pepper hair cut in a style that screamed expensive Manhattan barbershop. His charcoal black suit was perfectly pressed, and his silk tie was the color of dried blood. He didn't wait to be invited in. He walked past the stunned housekeeper and straight into the dining room, his leather soles clicking with rhythmic, terrifying precision against the marble floor. In his right hand, he carried a matte black briefcase with silver latches that caught the light of the chandelier. He stopped at the edge of the wreckage-strewn table, his eyes sweeping over the broken china and the spilled wine with the clinical detachment of a forensic investigator. He didn't look shocked. He looked like he was cataloging evidence. My father, Richard, was the first to find his voice. Though it was strained and high-pitched, he slammed his fist onto the table, causing the remaining silver to rattle. He demanded to know who this man was and how he dared to barge into a private family dinner on Thanksgiving. He shouted for the man to leave immediately, threatening to call the Greenwich police and have him charged with aggravated trespassing. Richard's face was a deep, mottled purple, his veins bulging at his temples as he tried to reclaim the authority that had been slipping through his fingers all night. The stranger didn't flinch. In fact, a faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of his mouth. He placed his briefcase on a sideboard, popped the latches with 2 crisp metallic clicks, and drew out a heavy cream-colored business card. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward my father. He introduced himself as Arthur Sterling, a senior partner at the Apex Law Group. He said he was there on behalf of his primary client, Mrs. Margaret Alcott. Richard's bravado vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The name Apex Law Group was whispered in the highest circles of the East Coast as the firm you called when you wanted to dismantle an empire or bury a rival. They were the legal equivalent of a tactical strike team. Richard looked at the card, then at Margaret, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He tried one last desperate gambit, telling Sterling that whatever business he had with Margaret could wait until Monday morning at his office. He claimed this was a private residence and that he was the master of the house, and he was ordering Sterling to get out before he used force. Sterling didn't move. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, blue-backed document bound with legal tape. He told Richard that there seemed to be a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the definition of a private residence. He flipped to the final page of the document and pointed to a signature. Sterling announced to the room that Margaret Alcott had never actually transferred the title of this Connecticut estate to her son. He explained that while Richard had been acting as the self-appointed lord of the manor for the last 20 years, the deed, the land, and even the very air they were breathing were legally owned by the Alcott Family Trust, of which Margaret was the sole surviving executor and trustee. Sterling turned to my mother, Eleanor, whose hand was trembling so much she had to set her wineglass down to avoid spilling it. He told her that not only was the house not theirs, but the 3 luxury vehicles in the garage, the country club memberships, and the very servants they employed were all billed directly to accounts funded by Margaret's London-based investments. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a cold, professional whisper, and revealed that Richard and Eleanor were, for all intents and purposes, guests who had overstayed their welcome by 2 decades. They were living on a mountain of charity that they had mistaken for their own success. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't just heavy, it was terminal. My mother looked like she was about to faint, her carefully applied makeup cracking under the strain of the revelation. Serafina was staring at Julian, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. The high society life they had been flaunting, the 5-carat rings, the Manhattan penthouses, the European vacations, it was all a facade built on a foundation of sand that Margaret had just washed away. As I sat there, watching the pillars of their world crumble, something inside me shifted. The shaking in my hands stopped. The hot, stinging tears that had been my only defense for years suddenly dried up, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized that the people sitting across from me weren't the giants I had feared. They were small, desperate thieves who had been caught in the act. I didn't wait for another insult. I didn't wait for permission. I reached up and slowly wiped the last of the tears from my face with a silk napkin, moving with a deliberate calm that seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the room. I stood up, not as the victim they had spent 4 years crushing, but with the posture of someone who had just realized they held all the cards. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out a chair that had remained empty all evening, and sat down. I crossed my legs, smoothed my second-hand coat, and looked directly at my father. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a father. I saw a middle manager who had been caught embezzling from his own mother. A thin, mysterious smile spread across my lips, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It was the kind of smile that made Richard flinch, a look of pure, predatory confidence that he had never seen in me before. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized that the unstable girl he had invented was gone, and in her place was a woman who was enjoying the view of his destruction. I took a slow sip of the expensive Bordeaux that remained in a glass near me, savoring the bitter, complex notes of the wine, and then I set it down with a click that echoed Sterling's footsteps. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. She whispered my name, her voice cracking, asking me what I was doing. I didn't answer her. I didn't even acknowledge she was there. I simply kept my eyes on my father, watching him wither under the weight of my silent, icy amusement. Margaret Alcott moved then. She stood up from her seat at the far end of the table and walked toward me. She didn't look at the wreckage or her son. She walked straight to my side and placed her hand on my shoulder. Her grip was firm, surprisingly strong for a woman of her age, and it felt like an endorsement. She looked at Sterling and told him that the preliminary stage was over. Margaret's voice was like a hammer striking an anvil. She told the room that up until this moment, she had been willing to believe that this was all just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. But after seeing the stolen letters in the basement and hearing the way they spoke to her granddaughter, she had decided to move forward with a full, comprehensive forensic audit of every single Alcott account. She announced that she had authorized the Apex Law Group to investigate 48 months of financial records, property transfers, and communication logs. She looked down at me, her eyes softening for a moment. Then she turned back to Richard and Eleanor with a gaze that could have frozen the sun. She told them that the protection they had offered me was about to be scrutinized by the best legal minds in the country. She declared that she wanted to know exactly where every cent of the $5 million penthouse fund had gone, and she wanted to know why her certified checks had been sitting in a basement mailbox while her granddaughter was working 80 hours a week just to survive. Sterling clicked his briefcase shut and stood at attention beside Margaret. He told the family that effective immediately, all access to trust-funded credit cards and liquid assets was suspended pending the results of the investigation. He informed Richard that he had exactly 24 hours to produce a full accounting of the Manhattan property or face immediate litigation for breach of fiduciary duty and grand larceny. Margaret squeezed my shoulder one last time, a silent promise of the carnage to come. She looked at her son and her daughter-in-law, who were now huddled together as if trying to shield themselves from a storm. She told them that the dinner was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. She announced that the real investigation, the one that would peel back every layer of their deceit, started now. I looked up at my grandmother and then back at my parents. The mysterious smile stayed on my face, a permanent fixture now. I wasn't just Genevieve the architect or Genevieve the barista anymore. I was Genevieve Alcott, the sole reason their world was about to end, and I had never felt more alive. "Julian," I said softly, my voice cutting through the whimpering of my sister. "I hope your parents have a good moving company on speed dial, because I'm going to need my penthouse back by Monday morning." The look of pure, unadulterated horror on Serafina's face as I spoke those words was worth more to me than any amount of money. The legal ghost had arrived, and he wasn't leaving until every single debt was paid in full. I leaned back in the heavy oak chair, the velvet upholstery feeling like a throne in the midst of a graveyard. My gaze was fixed on my father, Richard, whose expensive silk tie was now loosened, hanging like a noose around his neck. The legal presence of Arthur Sterling had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Leaving my family gasping in the vacuum of their own lies, I felt a cold, analytical surge of energy coursing through me. The house was one thing, the stolen money was another, but there was a deeper, more jagged wound that had festered in my soul for 4 years, the systematic destruction of my professional life. I looked at Richard and asked him a question that had haunted my sleepless nights for 48 months. I wanted to know about Nova Design Lab. I wanted to know about the final round of interviews at Sterling and Associates, and the 3 other top-tier architectural firms that had headhunted me right out of my Ivy League graduation. I reminded him that I had been the valedictorian, the golden girl with a portfolio that professors called generational. I told the table how I had sailed through 5 rounds of interviews at Nova, only to have the managing partner look at me with a mix of horror and pity during the final handshake before ghosting me entirely. I asked my father how it was possible that every single prestigious door in the city of New York had slammed shut in my face within the same 2-week window. Richard tried to look away, his eyes darting toward the shadows in the corner of the dining room, but Arthur Sterling didn't allow him that luxury. The lawyer reached into his black leather briefcase and pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. He turned the device toward the center of the table so that the glow of the screen illuminated the terrified faces of my parents. He announced that his team had performed a deep-dive digital forensic audit on the human resources servers of 7 major architectural firms. He said they had found a series of anonymous tips sent via encrypted email services, all of them arriving exactly 24 hours before my final hiring decisions. Sterling scrolled through the emails, reading the subject lines aloud in a flat, terrifyingly professional monotone. The first one was titled, "Confidential Warning Regarding Genevieve Alcott." The content was a masterpiece of character assassination. It accused me of stealing proprietary CAD files from my university's research lab to sell to foreign competitors. Even more chillingly, it included a fabricated medical report claiming that I had been diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia and was prone to violent, unprovoked outbursts in the workplace. The email warned the firms that hiring me would be a liability nightmare and a threat to the safety of their staff. I felt the blood drain from my face as I listened to the words. I looked at the bottom of the report where the lawyer pointed out the digital breadcrumbs. Sterling explained that while the sender had used a virtual private network to mask their identity, they had made a fatal mistake. They had accessed the encrypted service through the high-speed fiber optic internet protocol address, registered to this very mansion in Connecticut. The timestamps of the emails matched perfectly with the hours my father spent in his private study, supposedly working late on family business. Richard's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled purple. He began to stammer, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. He told me that I had to understand the pressure he was under. He claimed that he did it for my own good, because the city was a dangerous, cutthroat place that would have chewed me up and spat me out. He had the audacity to say that he wanted to bring me home to work for the family firm, to keep me under his wing where I would be safe. He said he was just trying to create a situation where I would realize that my only true support system was the Alcott family. I let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like breaking glass. I told him that he didn't want to protect me. He wanted to paralyze me. I realized that if I had become a high-earning architect at a top firm, I would have gained financial independence within 6 months. I would have hired my own accountants, checked my own credit, and discovered the $5 million trust fund Margaret had set up for me. By sabotaging my career, he ensured I remained a starving beggar, too exhausted from working 3 minimum-wage jobs to ever look closely at the paperwork he was signing in my name. But the betrayal didn't stop at my career. Sterling flipped to the next tab on his tablet, a spreadsheet filled with red numbers that looked like a digital bloodbath. He looked at my mother, Eleanor, who was now clutching her throat so tightly her knuckles were white. He revealed that while I was struggling to pay for a $10 bus pass, Eleanor had been using my social security number and my pristine pre-graduation credit rating to act as a straw man for a series of high-risk, predatory loans. He detailed a $300,000 loan from a private equity group with a 22% interest rate, taken out in my name to fund a boutique art gallery in Soho that Eleanor had opened and crashed within 8 months. There were another 5 private loans for lifestyle management and luxury vehicle leases, all bearing my signature, a signature that Sterling noted was a 98% match for Eleanor's own handwriting style. I sat there, numb, as the lawyer explained the reality of my life. My credit score, which should have been at the top of the charts, had been dragged down into the low 400s. I was blacklisted by every major bank and rental agency in the tri-state area. That was why my credit cards were always declined. That was how no landlord would even look at my application for a studio apartment. My mother had treated my future like a personal piggy bank, smashing it to pieces to fund her failed socialite dreams. And then she had the nerve to call me lazy and unsuccessful every time I asked for help. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I walked around the table until I was standing directly behind my mother and father. I looked down at the top of their heads, seeing the expensive hair treatments and the vanity for what they really were, a cloak for moral bankruptcy. I told them that I had spent years wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why the harder I worked, the deeper I sank into the mud. I had blamed myself for every failure, every rejection, and every hungry night. I leaned down, my voice a cold whisper that reached every corner of the room. I told them that they weren't parents. They weren't even human beings with a shred of conscience. I called them what they were, parasites. I told them they were leeches who had attached themselves to my life the moment I showed potential, sucking away my blood, my reputation, and my future, just so they could maintain a lifestyle they didn't earn. I told Eleanor that every time she looked at her reflection in her gallery's mirrors, she was looking at a thief who had robbed her own daughter's bed. Serafina, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the basement confrontation, suddenly saw a gap in the tension. She began to slide her chair back, her eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the kitchen and the side exit. She gripped her designer handbag, her movements frantic and jerky. She probably thought that if she could just get to Julian's car, they could drive back to the penthouse and lock the doors, hiding behind the marble walls that didn't belong to them. She didn't even make it 3 steps. Arthur Sterling moved with the speed of a man who had anticipated every possible escape route. He stepped into the doorway, his tall frame blocking her path like a wall of charcoal wool. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an absolute barrier. He told her, with a chillingly polite smile, that nobody was leaving the premises until the Greenwich police arrived to take formal statements regarding the identity theft and the fraudulent loan applications. Serafina let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek, telling him to get out of her way. She shouted that she was an Alcott and that she wouldn't be treated like a common criminal. Julian tried to stand up to support her, but one look from grandmother Margaret pinned him to his seat. Margaret hadn't said a word during the career revelation, but her face was a mask of cold, concentrated disgust. She looked at her daughter-in-law and her son as if they were insects she was about to crush under her heel. I walked back to my seat, but I didn't sit down. I looked at the wreckage of the Thanksgiving dinner, the turkey, the wine, the broken glass. It was a perfect metaphor for our family. On the outside, it looked like a dream. On the inside, it was nothing but decay and theft. I told my father that he had wanted me to come home to work for the family, and now his wish was coming true. I told him that I was going to spend every waking hour of the next year working with Mr. Sterling to dismantle his life, cent by cent, until he was the one sleeping in a battered car and wondering where his next meal was coming from. The room was silent again. Save for the sound of Eleanor's ragged, panicked breathing, the unstable daughter was gone. The architecture failure was gone. In their place stood the woman who was about to become their judge, jury, and executioner. Grandmother Margaret finally spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a guillotine. She told Sterling to move to the next phase of the audit. She said she wanted to hear about the machine identification code and the fake contracts Serafina had used to justify her occupation of the Manhattan property. She announced that the time for excuses was over, and the time for prison cells was drawing near. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The night was young, and I had a lifetime of revenge to catch up on. Serafina's breathing was a jagged, frantic sound that cut through the silence of the dining room like a dull saw. She lunged for her designer handbag, her fingers trembling so violently that she nearly knocked a crystal water pitcher onto the floor. With a triumphant, almost hysterical cry, she pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored bond paper. She slammed it onto the table, right in the middle of a puddle of spilled Cabernet, and smoothed it out with her manicured palms. She looked at Grandmother Margaret, her eyes wide and bloodshot, and screamed that she had the proof. She shouted that I was lying, that I had always been a jealous, unstable brat who couldn't handle the fact that she was the favorite. She pointed a shaking finger at a signature at the bottom of the page, my signature. She claimed that exactly 4 years ago, on the day after my graduation. I had sat right here and signed over the rights to the Manhattan penthouse to her as a token of sisterly love and a recognition that I wasn't fit to manage such a prestigious asset. I looked at the document. The signature was hauntingly familiar. It had the same slight tilt to the left, the same elongated tail on the final E of Genevieve that I had spent years perfecting. For a fraction of a second, I felt a wave of nausea. I wondered if they really had drugged me, if they had slipped something into my tea and guided my hand while I was in a stupor. But then I looked at Serafina's face. Beneath the bravado and the screeching, there was a layer of raw, naked panic. She was overacting. She was a woman clutching a life jacket that she knew was filled with lead. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, his expression as unreadable as a slab of granite. He didn't even look at the signature. He looked at the paper itself. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a compact, high-resolution digital microscope that looked like a sleek black cylinder. He connected it to his tablet with a silver cable and turned it on. A soft blue light emanated from the device as he hovered it over the blank white margin of the document. He asked Serafina to confirm one more time that this document was signed and finalized 4 years ago. In the autumn of the year I graduated. She snapped at him, telling him to check his hearing, and insisted that the date was right there in black and white. Sterling Mim Kui. A thin, predatory smile that sent a chill down my spine. He tapped a command on his tablet, and a magnified image of the paper's surface appeared on the screen for everyone to see. At first, it just looked like a chaotic landscape of white fibers, but as he adjusted the contrast and applied a specific digital filter, a pattern emerged. Scattered across the paper, almost invisible to the naked eye, were hundreds of tiny, microscopic yellow dots. They were arranged in a precise, geometric grid that looked like a secret code. Sterling began to explain the science with the cold precision of a hangman. He told the room about the Machine Identification Code, or MIC. He explained that almost every high-end color laser printer manufactured in the last 20 years embeds these microscopic yellow dots on every single page it prints. He said it was a forensic fingerprint used by the Secret Service and international law enforcement to track counterfeiters and terrorists. These dots, he explained, contain the serial number of the specific printer used and, more importantly, the exact date and time the document was created. The lawyer zoomed in on a cluster of dots near the top of the page. He cross-referenced the pattern with a database on his screen. Then, he looked at my father. He announced that the serial number encoded in these dots was a perfect match for the Xerox VersaLink C 7031 currently sitting in Richard Alcott's private study upstairs. But the real blow came next. Sterling read the timestamp aloud, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. He said that this document, which Serafina claimed was signed 4 years ago, was actually printed on August 24th of this year at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon. Serafina's jaw dropped, her mouth forming a silent, perfect circle of horror. The paper was barely 3 months old. The 4-year-old contract was a lie that had been manufactured just as Grandmother Margaret was beginning to plan her return from London. They had panicked. They had realized their illegal occupation of my life was about to be exposed, and they had rushed to create a backdated forgery to cover their tracks. But Sterling wasn't finished. He slid the microscope over the signature itself. On the tablet screen, the ink of my name appeared in terrifying detail. He pointed out the way the ink sat on top of the paper fibers, noting a strange, unnatural tremor in the lines. He then pulled up another image, a scan of a birthday card I had sent to my mother 5 years ago. He used a graphic overlay program to align the two signatures. They were identical, not just similar, but a 100% pixel-for-pixel match. He explained that in a real signature, there are always micro-variations in pressure and speed. No human being signs their name exactly the same way twice. But these two were clones. He turned to Serafina and told her that he had found the specialized graphic design software on her laptop, the one she used for her social media branding, and that he had recovered the deleted files where she had painstakingly traced my old signature from the birthday card and layered it onto the forged deed. He told her that she wasn't just a thief. She was a clumsy amateur. The weight of the evidence was absolute. The silence that followed was the sound of a family's soul rotting away in real time. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, the explosion happened. Richard surged to his feet, but he didn't go to comfort his daughter. He turned on my mother, Eleanor, with a face that was twisted with a cowardly, desperate rage. He screamed at her, accusing her of being the one who pushed for the forgery. He shouted that he had told her it was too risky, that they should have just found a way to pay Genevieve off. He claimed that Eleanor was the one who had convinced him to use the printer in his office, and that he was just a victim of her insatiable greed. He looked at Margaret, his voice cracking as he begged her to believe that he was just trying to keep the peace in his marriage. Eleanor didn't take the hit. She stood up, her face a mask of aristocratic venom, and shrieked at Richard. She called him a weak, pathetic excuse for a man who had been living off his mother's skirt strings for 50 years. She told him that the only reason they were in this mess was because his genius investments had lost 40% of their net worth in a single quarter. And they needed the penthouse equity to keep the banks from seizing this house. She turned her fury towards Serafina, calling her a stupid, careless girl for not being able to pull off a simple forgery without leaving a digital trail. She told her daughter that she was an embarrassment to the Alcott name and that she should have spent more time learning the law and less time taking selfies. Serafina began to wail, a high-pitched, thin sound that reminded me of a wounded animal. She screamed that she had done it for all of them. She shouted that she was the one who had to play the part of the successful sister while I was rotting in the gutter, and that they all enjoyed the champagne and the parties she hosted at the penthouse. She turned on Julian, accusing him of knowing about the forgery and encouraging it so he could impress his parents. The dining room descended into a cacophony of accusations and insults. It was an ugly, visceral display of the Alcott family values. There was no love here, no loyalty, not even the basic honor among thieves. There was only the desperate, clawing need to survive at the expense of everyone else. They were like rats in a flooding basement, biting each other's throats as the water rose. I sat there, watching them with a detachment that surprised me. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. I only felt a profound sense of relief that I was no longer one of them. Grandmother Margaret remained in her chair, her eyes closed, her hand still resting on my shoulder. She looked as though she were enduring a physical pain. But she didn't stop them. She let them scream, She let them tear each other apart until the air was thick with the stench of their mutual betrayal. She waited until Eleanor was mid-sentence, calling Richard a spineless parasite. Before she finally opened her eyes, she didn't raise her voice. But the moment she spoke, the room went cold and silent. She told them all to shut their mouths. She looked at the wreckage of her family and told them that she had seen more honor in a London street gang than she saw at this table tonight. She told Richard that his cowardice was only eclipsed by his stupidity. She told Eleanor that her greed had finally hollowed out her soul, and she looked at Serafina, the granddaughter she had once doted on, and told her that she was a common criminal who had just forfeited her freedom for a view of Central Park. I looked at Arthur Sterling. He was already typing on his phone, likely notifying the authorities that the formal establishment of forgery had been completed. He looked at me and gave a short, professional nod. The trap wasn't just set. It had already snapped shut. Richard tried one last time to reach out to me. His hand shaking as he leaned across the table, he whispered my name, telling me that we could fix this, that we were still a family. He said he would give me anything I wanted if I just told the lawyer to stop. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I truly saw the man behind the mask. He was nothing. I told him, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, that he was right. I told him we could fix this. I said we could start by him packing a single bag, because by the time the sun rose tomorrow, he wouldn't own the chair he was sitting in, let alone this house. I told him that the family he was talking about died 4 years ago. And I was just the one here to sign the death certificate. The cogs of the Alcott empire were grinding to a halt, and as the sound of a heavy vehicle pulled into the driveway, a sound that was distinct from the lawyer's sedan, I knew that the time for talking was over. The forensic evidence was on the table. The yellow dots were glowing on the screen, and the Alcott name was about to be dragged through the very mud they had tried to bury me in. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a heated family argument to something much colder and more clinical. Arthur Sterling did not look like a man who was finished. He stood at the head of the table, his fingers dancing across the screen of his tablet with a rhythmic, tapping sound that reminded me of a ticking clock. He looked at my mother, Eleanor, and told her that they were moving on to the most sophisticated part of the operation, the Genevieve Alcott Trust B account. I felt a jolt of confusion. I didn't have a Trust B. I didn't even have a functioning Trust A. But Sterling was already pulling up the digital ledger, projecting it onto the large flat-screen television on the dining room wall that usually displayed festive family photos, instead of pictures of us smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The screen was now filled with a cascading waterfall of bank transactions, rows upon rows of numbers that made my head spin. Sterling explained the mechanism with a chilling level of detail. He revealed that 4 years ago, Eleanor had opened a secondary account at a private bank in the Caymans using a power of attorney document that had been forged alongside the property deed. This account was linked to my social security number, but the only person with signature authority was Eleanor. Every month, for 48 months, a significant portion of my meager earnings from my 3 jobs had been intercepted. I stared at the screen, my heart stopping as I saw the names of the companies I had slaved for. There was the drafting firm, the coffee shop, and even the janitorial service. Sterling pointed out a recurring automatic debit, labeled as a family maintenance fee. He told the room that every time I deposited a paycheck, 35% of it was instantly diverted into this secret account before I even had the chance to pay my phone bill or buy groceries. I had been working 80 hours a week, surviving on peanut butter and tap water, while 35 cents of every dollar I earned was being funneled into a black hole managed by my own mother. But that wasn't the worst of it. Sterling scrolled down, showing larger deposits the monthly checks grandmother Margaret had been sending from London, which I had never seen. The lawyer announced the final tally with the finality of a judge passing a death sentence. He said that over the course of 4 years, the total amount of money embezzled from my wages and my grandmother's support checks totaled $812,460, $800,000. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. That was the money that could have paid off my student loans 10 times over. That was the money that could have put a roof over my head and allowed me to focus on my architecture career instead of scrubbing toilets at 2 in the morning. I looked at the screen, then at Eleanor, who was now hyperventilating, her hand clutching the back of her chair so hard her knuckles looked like white stones. Sterling didn't give her a chance to speak. He flipped the screen to the outbound transactions. This was the part where the financial thriller became a horror story. He detailed exactly where that $800,000 had gone. It wasn't used for family maintenance or to pay off the mortgage on the Connecticut house. The screen showed a series of wire transfers to luxury hotels in France. There were charges for $35,000 at a boutique on Avenue Montaigne in Paris, and another $20,000 for a private yacht charter in Saint-Tropez. There were hundreds of smaller transactions for designer handbags, high-end skincare, and first-class airline tickets. Every single one of these expenses was linked to Serafina's credit cards, but the funds to pay them off came directly from the account filled with my stolen wages. Serafina tried to stand up, her face a mask of indignation and terror. She screamed that she was an influencer, that she had a brand to maintain, and that the family had agreed she needed to look the part to attract a high-wealth husband like Julian. She shouted that it was an investment in the family's future, and that Genevieve was too plain to ever use that money for anything worthwhile anyway. Arthur Sterling turned his gaze toward Julian, who was sitting in a silence so deep he looked like a statue. The lawyer asked Julian if he remembered the consulting agreement he had signed with Richard and Eleanor 2 years ago. Julian tried to play dumb, saying he didn't know what Sterling was talking about, but the lawyer was already pulling up a contract. Sterling revealed that Julian wasn't just Serafina's husband. He was the legal architect of the entire scheme, as a junior associate at a rival firm. Julian had provided the legal framework for the wage diversion and the offshore account, in exchange for his expertise in hiding the money from tax authorities and from Margaret's auditors. Julian had received a referral fee of 10% of every dollar stolen from me. Julian had literally sold my life to buy himself a seat at the Alcott table. Grandmother Margaret stood up then, her presence so immense that even the lawyer paused. She looked at her son, Richard, who was now slumped in his chair. His eyes glazed with the realization that his life was over. Margaret didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words was enough to shatter what was left of the room's atmosphere. She told them that they had mistaken her generosity for weakness. She said she had funded their lifestyle, paid for their mistakes, and kept them afloat out of a sense of familial duty that they had spit on. She looked at Richard and announced that as of 10 minutes ago, she had contacted her banks in London, New York, and Zurich. She told him that every single credit card, every line of credit, and every trust-funded account he had access to had been frozen. She had revoked his authority over the Alcott family trust and had begun the process of reclaiming the deed to this very house. She told him that the only thing he currently owned was the suit on his back, and even that had been paid for with her money, so he shouldn't get too attached to it. Richard looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He gasped out a plea, telling his mother that she couldn't do this, that they would be on the street by morning. He reminded her that he was her only son. Margaret looked at him with a gaze so icy it could have frozen the Atlantic, and told him that she didn't have a son anymore. She only had a former employee who had been caught stealing from the till. The realization of their total, immediate bankruptcy hit the room like a physical shock. Eleanor began to sob, a loud, ugly sound that had no grace in it. Serafina was clutching her 5-carat diamond ring, probably wondering if she could sell it before the police arrived. Julian was already looking at his phone, likely trying to delete his correspondence, but Sterling informed him that all his devices had already been mirrored by a private cybersecurity team the moment he stepped into the house. I watched all of this from my seat, feeling a strange, intoxicating sense of calm. The girl who had been terrified of her own shadow an hour ago was dead. In her place was a woman who was finally seeing the world for what it was. I stood up slowly, the movement drawing the eyes of everyone at the table. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up a bottle of the 1995 Chateau Margaux that Richard had been saving for a special occasion. I didn't use a glass. I poured the dark, rich liquid into a crystal goblet, filling it to the brim. I walked back to my seat, my movements fluid and confident. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the complex notes of blackberry and oak, the taste of a luxury I had earned 1,000 times over with my sweat and my tears. I looked at the wreckage of the family, my father cowering, my mother wailing, my sister trembling, and I realized that this was the most beautiful Thanksgiving I had ever experienced. I set the glass down with a sharp, clear click against the wood. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old, cracked smartphone. I didn't need to look at the time. I could feel the seconds ticking away in the silence. I looked at Richard, and then at Eleanor, and I gave them that same mysterious, predatory smile that had made them rungmen earlier. I told them that they had spent 4 years building a cage for me, but they had forgotten to check who held the key. I looked at the clock on the wall and told them that it was exactly 9:30 in the evening. I announced to the room, my voice steady and devoid of any mercy, that I had made a phone call just before I entered the driveway. I told them that the Connecticut State Police, along with investigators from the district attorney's office, had been briefed on the identity theft, the forgery, and the embezzlement. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto Serafina's, and told her to enjoy the feel of the silk on her skin while it lasted. I said that the authorities were already at the gate of the estate. I told them that based on the speed they were traveling, the Connecticut State Police would be entering this dining room in exactly 5 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending. The Alcotts were no longer a family of status and wealth. They were just 4 criminals sitting in a house that no longer belonged to them, waiting for the handcuffs to click shut. I took another sip of my wine and waited for the sound of the sirens. The heavy, static-charged silence of the dining room was broken by the sharp, metallic snap of Arthur Sterling's briefcase opening for the final time tonight. He didn't look at the family members who were currently drowning in the wreckage of their own greed. He looked only at Grandmother Margaret, who stood at the head of the table like an ancient, vengeful queen. Margaret took a slow, deep breath, the silk of her scarf fluttering against her throat, and she commanded Arthur to read the document. She said she wanted her son, her daughter-in-law, and her granddaughter to hear exactly what their future looked like before the police arrived to escort them to it. Sterling pulled out a thick document bound in dark blue leather, embossed with the silver seal of the Alcott Family Trust. He announced to the room that he was holding the restated last will and testament of Margaret Alcott, executed and notarized at 10 o'clock this morning, shortly after her plane touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport. He looked at Richard, Eleanor, and Serafina with a gaze that was entirely devoid of human warmth and began to read the new terms with the cold, rhythmic cadence of a funeral march. The lawyer stated that as of this moment, Richard Alcott, Eleanor Alcott, and Serafina Alcott, along with her spouse Julian, were being officially and irrevocably stricken from every single branch of the Alcott inheritance. He read the words aloud, ensuring they echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. $0, 0 cents, and 0 assets. He explained that Margaret was exercising her absolute right as the sole trustee to terminate their status as beneficiaries due to proven moral turpitude and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. The shock of the words seemed to physically push my parents back into their chairs. The luxury they had breathed for 50 years was being sucked out of the room, leaving them in a vacuum of poverty. But the reading wasn't finished. Sterling turned the page and his voice grew even more resonant. He announced that the entirety of the Alcott estate, estimated at a net value of over $250 million, including this Greenwich mansion, the Manhattan penthouse, the London townhouses, and the diversified investment portfolios in Switzerland and New York, was being transferred into a new protected trust. He named me, Genevieve Alcott, as the sole, primary, and absolute heir to the entire fortune. I felt the weight of those words settle over me, not as a burden, but as a suit of armor. I looked at the 3 people who had tried to bury me alive, and I saw them for what they truly were, ghosts in a house that now belonged to me. The sound that followed was the most pathetic thing I had ever heard. My father, Richard, let out a strangled, sobbing cry and literally fell from his chair. He scrambled across the debris of the Thanksgiving dinner on his hands and knees until he reached Grandmother Margaret's feet. He grabbed the hem of her expensive wool skirt, his face wet with tears and snot, and began to wail. He begged her to reconsider, reminding her of the 40-plus years he had spent as her loyal son. He shouted that he had sacrificed his own ambitions to manage her American interests while she was away. He claimed that he had stayed by her side when her health was failing 3 years ago, and that his care for her should count for something now that he was at his lowest point. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't even look down at him. She looked straight ahead at the wall, as if she were staring through time itself. She told Richard to get his filthy, lying hands off her. Her voice was a low, terrifying growl that cut through his whimpering like a blade. She asked him if he really thought she was as senile as he had told everyone she was. She revealed that during her brief illness 3 years ago, she had become suspicious of the special tea he insisted on brewing for her every single night. She told the room that she had secretly saved a sample of that tea and had it analyzed by a private laboratory in London. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Margaret revealed that the results had shown a concentrated dose of liquid sedative and high-potency sleeping pills specifically, 300 milligrams of diphenhydramine mixed with other unprescribed tranquilizers. She accused Richard of drugging her for over 700 nights so that she would be too groggy and confused to notice him siphoning off millions of dollars into his and Eleanor's private accounts. She told him that his care was actually a slow-motion attempt to lobotomize his own mother for the sake of her checkbook. Richard's face went a ghostly shade of gray, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, his excuses dying in his throat as the full extent of his cruelty was laid bare. Eleanor, seeing her husband defeated, pivoted to the only weapon she had left, her manufactured maternal instinct. She turned toward me, her eyes brimming with large, glistening tears that looked entirely too practiced. She reached out across the table, her voice a soft, trembling whisper as she called me, "Jenny, my sweet, beautiful girl." She told me that she was so sorry for the misunderstandings, and that as a mother, she had only been trying to guide me through a difficult world. She claimed that deep down, everything she did was motivated by a fierce, protective love for her firstborn. She begged me to tell Margaret to stop this madness, saying that a daughter shouldn't watch her mother go to prison. She promised that if I just forgave them, we could start over as a real family, and she would spend the rest of her life making it up to me. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the woman who had told me just 2 hours ago that I was a stain on the family name. I saw the woman who had watched me starve while she bought designer handbags with my stolen wages. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face, the kind of smile you give a predator just before the trap snaps shut. I told her that it was funny she should mention being a shame. I reminded her of the countless times she had hissed in my ear that I was the Alcott family's greatest embarrassment because I couldn't keep up with their lifestyle. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers with a lethal intensity, and I told her that she was right about one thing. I told her that there was indeed a shame in this family. But it wasn't the girl working 3 jobs, I said. You told me I was the shame of the family, Mother. Now, look at yourself on the floor, begging for a life you stole. Tell me, who is the shame of the Alcott name now? The rejection hit Eleanor like a physical blow to the chest. Her face distorted, the fake maternal mask slipping to reveal the ugly, venomous woman underneath. She began to curse at me, calling me a cold-blooded monster who would regret the day I was born. Serafina, meanwhile, had reached her breaking point. The loss of the penthouse, the ring, the social status, and now the entire inheritance had shattered her fragile, narcissistic ego. She let out a high-pitched, piercing scream that sounded like a tea kettle exploding. She shouted that I was nothing but a lucky little rat, who had cheated her way into Margaret's heart. Before anyone could react, she lunged across the table, her fingers curled into claws, aiming for my face. She screamed that if she couldn't have the Alcott life, she would make sure I was too scarred to enjoy it. She didn't even get close. Two large, stone-faced men in dark suits, security personnel that Arthur Sterling had quietly signaled into the room moments earlier, stepped out of the shadows. One of them caught Serafina by the waist in midair, while the other pinned her arms behind her back with practiced, effortless efficiency. She thrashed against them, kicking over a silver candelabra and screaming obscenities that would have made a sailor blush. She was no longer the elegant Manhattan socialite. She was an unhinged, petulant child throwing the final tantrum of her life, just as the chaos reached its peak. A new sound began to filter through the heavy, frosted windows of the mansion. It started as a low, distant hum, but quickly grew into a rhythmic, mechanical wail. It was the sound of police sirens, not one or two, but a whole fleet of them, echoing off the stone walls of the driveway. I looked toward the windows and saw the first flickers of light cutting through the November fog. Blue and red strobes began to dance across the white walls of the dining room, splashing over the broken plates, the spilled wine, and the terrified faces of my family. The lights were hypnotic, a swirling kaleidoscope of justice that announced the arrival of the real world. The Alcott bubble, the world of protected wealth and hidden crimes, was being pierced by the cold, hard light of the law. I watched as the reflections of the sirens pulsed over Richard's slumped form, Eleanor's frozen mask of rage, and Serafina's pathetic struggles. Arthur Sterling looked at his watch, and then at me. He announced that the Connecticut State Police had arrived, along with a specialized white-collar crime unit from the district attorney's office. He said the gate had been opened, and they were currently coming up the driveway. Grandmother Margaret finally reached out and took my hand. Her skin was cool, her grip unshakable. She looked at me, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and a sadness that only she could understand. She told me to stand tall. She said that tonight, the Alcott name was being cleansed, and that I was the only one worthy of carrying it into the future. I stood up, the blue and red lights illuminating my face as the front doors were thrown open with a thunderous bang. I didn't look away. I didn't hide. I watched as the officers in dark uniforms flooded into the foyer, their badges gleaming in the strobe light glare. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was in the room, and for the first time in 26 years, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. The heavy thud of tactical boots on the marble foyer echoed like thunder, instantly killing the hysterical screams of my sister. The front doors hadn't just been opened. They had been breached by the weight of professional authority. A swarm of officers in dark navy uniforms, their badges glinting under the strobe-like flashes of blue and red lights from outside, flooded into the dining room. The Alcott sanctuary was officially a crime scene. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded in front of me, watching the chaos with the detached curiosity of someone observing an ant farm. As the lead investigator stepped toward the center of the wreckage, Arthur Sterling didn't miss a beat. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, red-stamped folder. He didn't just hand over the criminal complaints for identity theft, grand larceny, and elder abuse. He pulled out a second, distinct document. It was a formal civil demand, a legal invoice for my life. I looked at my father, who was being pressed against the sideboard by an officer, and I spoke clearly so the body cams would catch every word. I announced that I was filing a civil suit for $10 million in compensatory and punitive damages. I broke it down for them as they struggled $5 million for the 4 years of professional architectural earnings I lost due to their sabotage, $2 million for the systematic destruction of my credit and the resulting homelessness, and $3 million for the intentional infliction of emotional distress and the physical toll of working 80-hour weeks in manual labor while they lived in my home. I told Richard that since he loved managing my assets so much, he could spend the rest of his life managing a debt that he would never be able to pay back. The room was a blur of motion. I watched, my heart rate steady and cold, as a female officer forced Eleanor's hands behind her back. The clink of the handcuffs was a beautiful, rhythmic sound. Eleanor began to wail, a high-pitched, vibrating sound that lacked any of her usual aristocratic grace. She begged the officers to look at her dress, claiming she was a victim of an assault by her crazy daughter. I didn't even blink. I just watched the silver rings of the cuffs bite into her wrists, the same wrists that had worn a $50,000 watch bought with my stolen money. Then came the moment they didn't see coming. Serafina was still struggling with the security guards, shouting that there was no proof of anything. I walked over to the massive, ornate crystal chandelier that hung above the table, a centerpiece my mother had bragged about for years. I reached into a small, decorative brass leaf near the base and pulled out a tiny pinhole lens. I looked at the table and pointed to 4 other locations, the hollowed-out eyes of a decorative pumpkin, the base of the silver wine cooler, and a small gap in the crown molding. I revealed to the room that from the very second I stepped into this house tonight, every single confession, every admission of forgery, every threat of gaslighting, and every boast about managing my life had been recorded in high-definition video and synchronized audio. I told them that Arthur Sterling had the live feed uploaded to a secure cloud server 45 minutes ago. They hadn't just confessed to me, they had confessed to a global digital jury. The look on Richard's face was one of pure, soul-crushing defeat. He realized that the unstable daughter had outmaneuvered him before the first course was even served. Julian, seeing the walls closing in, tried to play his final card. He stepped toward the lead investigator, his voice smooth and transactional. He claimed he was a victim of the Alcott's deception as well, and offered to testify against Richard and Eleanor in exchange for full immunity. He said he had documented evidence of their schemes that could save the state a lot of time and money. I let out a short, sharp laugh and signaled to Mr. Sterling. The lawyer pulled out a separate, thinner file. I looked at Julian and told him that loyalty among thieves was a myth. I revealed that we had already spent 3 weeks digging into his private offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. I presented the investigator with evidence of a massive tax evasion scheme where Julian had used the money stolen from my wages to wash his own unreported consulting fees. I told him that he wasn't going to be a witness. He was going to be a cellmate. The color drained from Julian's face so fast, he looked like a marble statue as the officers turned their attention toward him. The handcuffs clicking shut on his tailored sleeves. The officers began to lead them out. Richard was stumbling, his legs failing him as he was dragged past the half-eaten turkey and the spilled Bordeaux. Eleanor was hiding her face in her hair, sobbing about the scandal and how her social life was over. But it was Serafina who stopped at the door. She twisted her head back, her eyes wide with a terrifying, venomous hatred. She screamed at me, her voice cracking, asking me how I could be so cruel. She wanted to know how a sister could do this to her own flesh and blood, how I could stand there and watch them be destroyed without shedding a single tear. I didn't flinch. I took a slow sip of the wine that was still in my hand, the taste of it crisp and final. I looked her right in the eyes and told her that I wasn't being cruel. I was being an Alcott. I told her that since she believed I was too unstable to handle my own affairs, I had decided to return the favor. I told her that I was simply managing her future in a prison cell for the next 10 to 15 years, making sure she didn't have to worry about the burden of making any choices for herself. I said, "I'm just keeping you safe from the world, Serafina, just like you did for me." The front door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the now empty mansion. The silence that followed was heavy and clean, like the air after a massive storm. Grandmother Margaret and I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows in the drawing room. Outside, the night had turned a brilliant, crystalline white. The first snow of the season was falling in large, soft flakes, coating the long, winding driveway. We watched in silence as the parade of police cars, their lights still pulsing with blue and red energy, slowly wound their way down the hill. They looked like a string of jewels moving through the dark woods of Connecticut. Each flash of light was a second further away from the life I had been forced to live. I felt Margaret's hand on my shoulder, a steady, solid weight that told me I was no longer alone. We stood there until the last flicker of a siren disappeared into the fog of the interstate. The Alcott legacy was a charred ruin, but I was the one standing in the ashes with a blueprint for a new empire. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers didn't tremble as I scrolled through my contacts. I found the number for Mr. Henderson, the landlord of the crumbling, mold-infested apartment building in Queens where I had been evicted just 48 hours ago. The man who had laughed when he threw my duffel bags into the rain. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice gruff and annoyed. He asked who was calling at this hour. I stood in the center of the $1 million mansion, looking at the snow, and I told him my name. I told him I was Genevieve Alcott. I didn't wait for him to recognize me or start his usual rant about the back rent. I cut him off and told him that by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, his lawyers would receive a cash offer for his entire building, along with the 3 other properties he owned on that block. I told him the price was non-negotiable and that I expected him to be moved out of his office by noon. I told him, "I'm buying your building, Mr. Henderson, and I'm buying it right now." I ended the call before he could respond. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the unstable girl or the failure or the beggar. I was the one who owned the board, and the game had only just begun. Thank you for listening to this story of betrayal and ultimate justice. I would love to hear your thoughts on Genevieve's journey. Please leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect. If you enjoyed this reckoning, please subscribe to the Family Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this tale of truth prevailing over greed.